There's no point in building castles in the air. We must live in the here and now. I am sure the great majority of us wish we were not where we are. We would prefer that the era, beginning in the late 1970s, of globalization and multilateralism, and that was characterized by relative stability and cooperation in the relationship between the United States and China, was still in place. It is not. And it will not return, in my view, for a long time. The reason for the breakdown in the old order is profound, as is invariably the case with great historical shifts. We need to understand the causes. The period between the late 1970s and 2016 was marked by three underlying features: a new phase of globalization, the hegemony of neoliberalism in the West, and a stable modus vivendi between China and the United States. Two things served to undermine this era. One was an event, the other a much longer process. The event was the Western financial crisis in 2007-8, the worst since the 1930s. It fatally wounded neoliberalism in the West, led to many years of supine economic growth, a stagnation in living standards in most Western countries, and a backlash against globalization. The result was the undermining of the authority and credibility of Western governing elites and the governing institutions, together with the rise of anti-establishment populism. In the United States, it created the conditions for the rise of Trump and a profound shift in US policy, both domestically and internationally. The longer-term process I referred to concerned the changing balance of power between China and the United States. In the late 1970s, the Chinese economy was tiny compared with the United States. Furthermore, the US believed that unless China became a Western-style country with a Western-style political system, its modernization would prove unsustainable. And likewise, it never imagined that the Chinese economy would ever come to rival the size of the US economy. After the financial crisis, the US slowly began to realize that on both counts, it was profoundly mistaken. China was no longer a relatively insignificant junior partner, but now appeared competitive. And China's political system was far more robust than intended. This dawning realization persuaded the US establishment that China's rise had to be resisted, at a minimum, at least slowly. While Trump was the initiator of this turn against China, it is important to recognize that it has widespread bipartisan support in the United States. The Trump administration is seeking to reverse the norms of the previous era from the late 70s until 2016, to weaken globalization, undermine global trade by embracing protectionism, displace multilateralism in favor of US power, sideline the WTO, and wound China through the imposition of tariffs and the introduction of sanctions against its tech industries, most notably Huawei. It is a sobering reminder that history never travels indefinitely in one direction. In 1914, it was generally believed that the trend towards globalization that had dominated the period after 1870 was irreversible. They were wrong. The world was soon to be ravaged by two world wars, protectionism, the division of the world into autarkic economic blocks, and the worst ever economic crisis. The world, in other words, can go backwards as well as forwards. Trump's economic policy is a reversion to the nationalistic and isolationist thinking that informed much US policy in the 19th century and in the 20th century prior to the Second World War. It is now America's response to its declining position in the world and the fear that its dominant position would be usurped by China. How does the rest of the world respond? In the longer run, the trend towards globalization will be resumed. An increasingly globalized world means the growing interdependence of nations in a multitude of ways, from economic and cultural to environmental and the overarching challenge of climate change. These arguments and imperatives have not gone away, even if they have now been displaced in some degree by the tide of nationalistic populism. At the heart of America's shift is the question of China. How does China respond? The shift in America's position is not for the short term. It is the beginning of a new era which seems likely to last maybe for 20 or so years. Bear in mind, in this context, that the previous era of globalization lasted for rather more than 3 decades. China will have to learn to live in a world that is increasingly divided and in which the US seeks to isolate it. We will all be casualties of this new global regime, including, of course, China and the United States. In my view, though, the US will be a much bigger loser in the longer run than China. The US will cut itself off from China, the world's biggest, most dynamic and competitive market, and its competitiveness will suffer greatly as a consequence. China is the rising power, the United States is the declining power. The US's retreat into the autarky and isolationism will only serve to hasten its decline. At some point, still a long way in the future, it will come to recognize this fact, that it needs China and a new kind of relationship with China, which is based on equality. China is patient. It is one of its great strengths. In contradistinction to the United States, it thinks long term. It understands now is not forever. China will be a very different and new kind of great power. Its rise has been remarkably peaceful in a way that the equivalent rise of the United States, or indeed the UK, France, Germany and Japan was not. They all fought many wars of expansion. China has not. It has a different way of thinking, born of a very different history. China will find a way to resist America's attempts to weaken and isolate it. We can be sure of that. China's rise will continue, but at the same time it will and should keep its lines of communication with the US open, avoiding giving the US any reason or excuse to further poison their relationships. China's caution is already manifest. It has responded to America's protectionist moves against it and its attempts to hobble Huawei, but very cautiously, seeking not to exacerbate the relationship and give the US cause to further up the ante. This is most important. Always avoiding sacrificing the long term for short-term gain. China, meanwhile, must intensify its efforts to build bridges and strengthen its relations with as many countries as possible. In this way, it will seek to resist America's attempts to isolate it, while at the same time demonstrating to the world its multilateral objectives and values. Thank you.